Hello, my name is David Obura. I'm a director of Cordio East Africa, and Cordio is a member of IUCN. And I'm speaking at IUCN's regional Forum for Africa in June 2024. And this keynote presentation was for the beginning of the event, but was cut short, so I'm recording it now. So hopefully it's useful to members and others. The topic is on African solutions for nature and people, and really looking for creating transformative responses to the biodiversity and climate crisis that we face in Africa and moving forward. Now, this is the structure of my talk, going through an introduction, which is based on narratives, IPBES frameworks, and the urgency of what we have to address, then Africa's challenges and opportunities, and then thinking forward to IUCN's role and contributions in the next work program and new vision for the next 20 years. Now, this presentation is really a very integrative and bird's eye view picture, not focused on conventional conservation actions and status. It has a very strong focus on equity for all people, inclusive of Indigenous people and local communities. And the hope is that I invite you to see your specific context through the lens of what I'm presenting here, rather than presenting a particular focal area. Now, the narrative approach that is based on really builds on the Sustainable Development Framework. So the SDG icons are shown up in the top, but in a circle rather than a rectangle. And the perspective here is to look at a local space, so here a coastal zone, through all of the goals and understanding how they relate to people's lives locally in that space. And working with fishing communities in East Africa, what this image is based on in this illustrated conservation magazine online is looking at the lives of a couple, Hamisi and Mariam, in a fishing community, and how their lives are dependent on the reef that supplies their fish, their investment of the community in a protected area, the links to tourism and other stakeholders in the area, local tourism operators, and equity issues and how benefits are shared in this local area. And these little icons relate the different Sustainable Development Goals to each of these pieces of the puzzle. And it's possible to draw up a narrative like this for any space and mention all of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. The other perspective I'd like to use as a foundation is from IPBES, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which I now chair. Now, we produce large scientific assessments or syntheses. We've produced 13 already. There are 3 in the pipeline coming out in late 2024 and in 2025, and 4 to come up to 2029. But to organize this scientific work, we have a conceptual framework that I'll explain in the next slide. And we also have this framework of the nature's contributions to people, which I'll also explain, and provide a nice frame, I think, for understanding how to address conservation and sustainability in local spaces. Now, the conceptual framework was developed over about 2 years of very in-depth scientific and Indigenous peoples consultations. It really explores how nature at the bottom supplies contributions to people, so the various resources and ecosystem services that we use. They support a good quality of life. And then through our institutions and governance and activities, we impose indirect and direct drivers back down on nature. Now, it's a very complex framework, and it's difficult to communicate, and it's very useful in a scientific context. And what I've been looking for as IPBES chair is how to communicate it in more accessible language. And in the end, I think this nature, economy, society, the 3 pillars of sustainable development, which were really used to develop the Sustainable Development Goals at the same time as the IPBES conceptual framework was being developed, is very useful. So nature at the bottom is the same, and then really the arrows and the boxes in the IPBES conceptual framework can really be placed around this stack of nature providing direct contributions and direct uses to economic activities which support societal benefits, and they may be shared less or more equally amongst people in society. And then societal values impose indirect drivers or controls on economic activities, which impose direct drivers on nature and the state of nature in the future. And so this is an alternative view based on the IPBES conceptual framework that I think is quite helpful. And the reason is that this enables us to look at conservation, so in this IUCN scope, not just in terms of actions on nature, which we'd like to conserve at the bottom, but the linked actions on economy and actions on society that are necessary to balance this entire system. And then these, of course, relate to the global policy frameworks, which I won't really address in this talk, but the Sustainable Development Goals, the Global Biodiversity Framework. In Africa, we have the new African Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan adopted by the African Union. Now, in terms of nature's contributions to people, this grey box between nature and economy, it's important to look at this arrow because these are basically the direct interactions that humanity has with nature, some of the physical extraction, the things that we seek value from and support from. Now, IPBES has identified 18 classes of nature's contributions to people in the global assessment in 2019. They extend across a wide range of different, includes ecosystem services, but also more intangible gifts from nature. So regulation of climate, number 4, for example, or food and feed, number 12, but also supporting identities, number 17. Now, what we did in that assessment is look at the decline show that most contributions to people are in decline, that red column on the left and the arrows pointing downwards, but there are 3 pointing upwards. And it should come as no surprise that these 3 contributions or ecosystem services that have been increasing in production globally over decades are those that we commodify in our economic activities. So we maximize the production of energy, the production of food, and the production and the extraction of materials from nature. But it's that very maximization that is driving declines in all the other contributions which we don't value in our economic systems. Now I've put a red box around the regulation of climate on the left, so that's carbon sequestration. We're beginning to commodify that. We're putting a price on carbon and carbon markets. And of course we want to increase that. But the problem is if we maximize that with the same approaches as we have maximized production of the other 3, we'll just further the declines in other contributions that are important, but we don't monetize. And so understanding this entire system and optimizing balance across the system is a very important frame for us to have, not just maximizing the production of any single item on its own. A couple of slides on the urgency of action and why we need to address the balance in the system now. So a major driver of decline globally has been pointed, or global population has been fingered as a major driver of decline. But is it economy or is it population? Now, these column graphs show the change in global wealth or economy and global population from 1970 to 2020. And global population has doubled in that period of time, but global wealth has increased 25 times. And that's a much stronger driver of decline than just a doubling of global population. And I'll come back to this in a moment. But these are the graphs from the Great Acceleration showing this relationship very well. All these drivers are really examples of economic drivers of paper production, for example, energy use, large dams. This immense increase is much faster than global population increases, and that's all comes from economic growth. Now, of course, population can be a problem. This graph is of global population across the continents. Thinking about Africa, of course, now the African population does not have a footprint on the global signal of biodiversity decline at the moment. It does locally, because locally overpopulation can degrade ecosystems. But as African population grows towards that of Asia during this century, and as African economies will grow, as they must, to reduce poverty in all our countries, our impact on global biodiversity will increase as well, and we do need to avoid and minimize that. The second item that we really need to keep an eye on in terms of the urgency of action is the climate crisis. Here I've chosen to show the cumulative carbon dioxide emissions since 1750, so this is over the industrial period. And the important factor in climate change is the total accumulation of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and this apportions it across countries and continents across the world. The main point to point out here is how small Africa's contribution to overall climate change has been, just 3% of total carbon dioxide emissions from the continent, and making the point we have only 5 years to consume the remaining CO2 to stay within the 1.5 degree warming limit, which is very concerning now. The second graph shows the increase in global average temperature over the last few decades, showing how soon we're about to cross the 1.5 degree limit over there on the right. We reached about 1.27 degrees warming last year in terms of the average temperature, and this trend predicts about 10 or forecasts 10 years to reach the 1.5 degree threshold. But this is over a 20-year average that the IPCC uses. But year on year now, we almost reached 1.5 degrees warmer than pre-industrial last year, very likely to exceed that in the next few years. And it's already having immense impacts locally on communities, landscapes, people across Africa and across all parts of the world as well. So the urgency of dealing with this threat is very high. So now thinking through Africa's challenges and opportunities, and what I'll try and do is just draw a narrative through this progression from conservation through sustainability, the importance of inequality, and then finally finance before coming to the conclusions. Now, IPBES's regional assessments in 2018. This is Africa's regional assessment and an infographic just showing the Africa's richness of biodiversity across these 5 different subregions within Africa, and illustrating the status of biodiversity using the IUCN Red List of Species as illustrated or synthesized in that report, and then a recent paper synthesizing the IUCN Red List of Ecosystems from countries with enough data. And of course, showing a lot of yellow, orange, and red in these graphics with high levels of threat across nature. Now, the main protection and conservation actions that we're investing in, or we have invested in the last 10 years with the HE targets, is in protected areas. And this map shows the terrestrial and marine protected areas across African spaces, the percentage. Now the targets in the Global Biodiversity Framework are to reach 30%, so we're some way off that, with the potential for other effective conservation measures to come into play to help meet those targets. But protected areas are not a panacea. They can't resolve all threats, and they are affected by external pressures. And this graph, I'm just showing one example, is a nice synthesis of showing the decline of birds in and outside of protected areas in Africa. Inside protected areas in orange, outside of protected areas in grey, and that there are declines throughout, but better status within protected areas and outside. But the reasons are all these different biodiversity and conservation challenges that practitioners face on a day-to-day basis, so resource use conflicts, human-wildlife conflict, management capacities, infrastructure challenges, and so on. So there's a whole litany of processes and threats that we deal with in trying to conserve biodiversity. And then in the middle there, the specific causes of the bird decline and how they are affected both inside and outside of protected areas. Now, the main point that I want to draw from this is that because protected areas and just direct actions on biodiversity are not enough, we need to really integrate action across land and seascapes. So protection and conservation areas exist in a wider matrix of production and other zones, and we need to really pay attention to 100% spatial planning across land and sea areas, and that relates to Target 1 of the Global Biodiversity Framework. The big question is what proportion of space in a country, for example, or in a local jurisdiction needs to be intact nature that supports global values such as preventing extinction of species, versus what proportion needs to be well-functioning in terms of supporting ecosystem services or nature's contributions locally, or also that might be exported through farming or production activities. And this landscape graphic is one was put out in the IPBES IPCC joint workshop report in 2021, depicting this mosaic concept, which I'll come back to in a moment. Another effort which is looking at this that I was part of, is through the Earth Commission, looking at planetary boundaries or Earth system boundaries, and identifying how do we identify a safe and just operating space in relation to these major Earth systems that need to be in balance for our planet to thrive. I've focused on the biodiversity one because that's the area I work in, but also within that we have two boundaries we looked at: intact ecosystems as well as how altered ecosystems support people's needs. In terms of intact ecosystems, this is really those areas of land that are still identifiable as the original biome. Now, the planetary boundary is that globally this percentage should not fall below 50 to 60%, and we are just below that boundary globally. And then, but of greater interest for me, thinking about people and nature together, is these altered ecosystems and how in farming or pastoralist or fishing areas, how do we really support people? What kind of function is needed that we can integrate conservation and sustainable use together in these zones? A key concept here is that it's not just safety that's important, but also justice. That's the needs of individual people. All people need to be met. And in order to address this, what we did was we looked down to a square kilometer scale, because this does two things. One, it matches the general activity space of people in landscapes and on seascapes, but also across multiple ecosystem services or benefits from nature. Many of these operate at very small scales down to a few hundred meters. So pollinators may fly a few hundred meters from their habitats. So if a farmer has crops, they need to be within a few hundred meters of the habitat that the pollinators depend on. And if you look at this, we did a review of the literature across 6 of these nature's contributions to people, and we found that about 20 to 25% of each square kilometer, if there's well-functioning or semi-natural habitat in that square kilometer, these benefits or these contributions can be met. But currently only 30% of non-natural land, so 30% of the 50% of landscapes that are not intact meet this criterion. 70% are below this level. So people living in that 70% don't get the benefits from nature that they need. So coming back to looking at a landscape, the idea here is that we can look at one, we identified in this graphic, there are 3 types of zones. So in blue are the large, remote, intact biomes. We need to avoid further loss in these biomes because we are below the planetary boundary on those areas, since they're circled in blue on that map. But then in yellow are what we've called shared spaces that are not intact. They are altered by people. But there is a level of sustainability there, and in red is very highly intensive agriculture and urban areas in which nature is no longer intact. And in these latter 2 spaces, if we can apply this new boundary of 20 to 25% nature in every square kilometer, then we can attempt to meet people's needs and also secure biodiversity at those scales too, in fragments of habitat. So, but this working at the square kilometer also helps focus at the local scale in jurisdictions. It helps focus on equity and people at those scales. They can be present to represent themselves. And then we can blend different knowledge systems, local knowledge, traditional and scientific knowledge in local spaces to find solutions. And also, in the end, we don't only need to address biodiversity targets. We could also try and meet social and economic ones as well. So the process proposed in these shared spaces at any single location, such as these locations A, B, and C, we can come down and help those jurisdictions based on local values and cultures identify how they might contribute to global targets and global sustainability, meeting their own local needs, as well as to benefit from global resources in doing that. And then in these local spaces, through this 20 to 25% semi-natural habitat per square kilometer, support sustainable production, restoration, and regeneration actions, help meet biodiversity targets. Now, the other thing is that securing nature at this level in fragments at square kilometer scales, we can also attempt to anchor finance to these secured packets of nature. And the idea is that they would be secure in local jurisdictions, but they can be supported by finance from elsewhere, which I'll come back to in a moment. And then, of course, we address local priorities. So the issues of human-wildlife conflict, food production, extreme events vulnerability that many practitioners are engaged in can be addressed through this kind of a model in local scales as well. I want to turn to inequality now as a driver. Now, the global economy is the primary driver of global biodiversity decline, but economic actors are not all equal. So this graphic shows the growth in G7 economies and in low-income country economies from 2000 to 2020. They have both more or less doubled over this period of time. And these graphs are useful also because there's about a similar number of people in each of these categories, so about 700 to 800 million people. But the difference is you can see the G7 economies are about 100 times larger than the low-income country economies. And it's not the low-income country economies that are driving the economic impacts on global scales. We can illustrate this with carbon dioxide emissions, and it's useful to use carbon dioxide rather than income for this because it's becoming understood or recognized as a currency or something that's monetizable, but also it's physical. It's a physical entity. We can measure it, and we know the transitions from one form to another. And this graph is from the Climate Inequality Report in January 2023, and it shows three aspects by global population split in these three brackets by income level. So the bottom 50%, the middle 40%, and the top 10%. And we see that in green, the emissions of each of these groups, the relative losses in red, which of course are much higher in the bottom 50%, and the capacity to finance adaptation or to deal with climate threats is much higher in the top 10%. Now, it's useful to break this down in two ways here. So first here on the left, I want to take the percentage of emissions in each of these classes and break it down into equal 10 percentile or decile groups. And you can see that the top 10% of the global population emits about 50% of the total carbon dioxide emissions, and the bottom 50% in each of those deciles emit much less, about 8% apiece there. 8% divided by 5 in the bottom row there. Now, another perspective is to look at the vulnerability of each of these groups divided by their contribution of carbon dioxide emissions. And this gives a measure of impact, inequity or inequality between them. If you scale the top 10% to 1, then the poorest 50%, each of those deciles or people in each of those deciles have about 150 times greater impact or vulnerability to the carbon that they emit than the top 10% do. And so what these graphs show is that we really need to redistribute wealth on the left in terms of who has access to carbon dioxide emissions, who should be using energy and at what levels. And on the right, the redistribution of risk from those who have no resources to cope with risk in the bottom to those who do have resources to cope with risk at the top. And this redistribution corresponds to this rule of thumb that I've come across a few times, a 10, 40, 50, which is to live like the middle 40%, raise welfare in the bottom 50%, and enable this by reducing impacts and redistribution from the top 10%. Now, coming to finance, because that's what that inequality discussion leads to, is let's consider the area of this slide to correspond to the global GDP of about $105 trillion per year. Now, nature negative aspects, components of the economy are estimated at 6.7 trillion, of which about a quarter of that is from public funds and the rest is private funds. And if we look at the nature positive components of the global economy, so current biodiversity funding is about 135 billion in blue, overseas development assistance and philanthropy about 13 billion as a part of that. And then within that, Africa's share of that ODA is about 34%, or 4 billion, the little white box we can barely see. There's about $200 billion spent on nature-based solutions every year. But there's this huge biodiversity funding gap of $830 billion in grey, which of course is dwarfed by the nature negative box as well. The Global Biodiversity Framework has 2 targets on raising finance for nature. Target 19 to raise an additional, or to assure $200 billion in finance for nature every year, and target 18 to repurpose 500 billion of those nature negative activities to nature positive. But these don't really match the scale of the challenge that we're facing. And while, of course, we need to meet these targets, there's a lot deeper transformation that has to happen about how the global financial system really addresses its impacts on nature. So there are potential sources or approaches to try and transform this system, and of course many financial minds are dealing with this. One can look at historical carbon emissions because those give a quantification of perhaps a debt owed to the climate system by those that have emitted the most carbon. And one can also look at levels of wealth, because wealth really embodies extraction, historical extraction, that has been accumulated from natural capital up into financial capital. And of course, there are other ways too. The positive perspective, as I mentioned before, looking at the landscapes, is to really link finance to fragments of nature at 1 kilometer scales, wherever they are in the world. And they can be, with GIS, we know exactly where each of these fragments can be, and their state can be reported in terms of their condition and the provisioning of multiple contributions to people as well, to show the benefit with the work that finance is doing that is being invested in those places. So finally, this is all important because we need to address trends in nature and its contributions to people, to think not only about where we are now, but where we may get to, where we need to get to in the future. Now, these 3 lines are quite well-known study, future scenarios of bending the curve of biodiversity decline. They really synthesize, so business as usual, the grey line at the bottom, continuing as was considered in around 2010 to 2015 when the study was being started. If all conservation and restoration actions are done to the fullest extent in the HE targets initially, but also consider the Global Biodiversity Framework now in yellow. And in green is in addition to those conservation and restoration actions, if the right production and consumption actions are done to reduce the impacts of economic activities or reduce the drivers of decline so that nature can recover to a better state than it was, in this case, in 2010. It's worth looking at where we are now, 2024 on those graphs. So basically somewhere between the yellow and the grey curves, probably. It's a bit hard to know precisely where we are there. And it's a sobering thought to realize that from 2010 until now, even if we had done all the right conservation and restoration actions in the HE targets, we wouldn't yet be able to differentiate, the good actions or the outcome of the good actions we've done from business as usual. It's only in the coming 5, 10, 20 years that we can really see the benefits of that investment. And so the long-term perspective is very important. A new study just came out earlier this year, which really shows the importance of conservation actions. They showed that looking at a range of conservation and restoration actions, only 45% showed an absolute positive impact. So the state of nature improved in those studies than if they were not done. About 21% showed a reduced decline, so biodiversity still declined in those studies, but not as much as if the actions hadn't been taken. And then about 1/3 had either no effect or net negative effects. But it does show that business as usual is better than no conservation actions, which is very important. And the importance of all the effort that's needed to improve the effectiveness of conservation actions from the red and the grey sort of up into the yellow part of these curves. So actions on nature are critical to invest in, but even at maximum efficacy, they're not enough. And we need to address production and consumption drivers of decline. And I've attempted to show in this presentation that equity is really a foundational element in thinking about how we go about reducing those production and consumption drivers, and why and by whom and so on. Now, what should we do given where we are now and these trajectories into the future? I've added up at the top here the nature positive icon that's been used to motivate for nature positive actions, and transposed it onto these curves over here. And I think, speaking now in the context of IUCN, so in the science and conservation community, the practitioners and the scientists and communities, in red here, there are two things I think we can do ourselves and we really need to do much more effectively. So one is to understand and maximize the true impacts of direct biodiversity actions so that we really get to that yellow curve with all the actions that we're implementing. But also we need to have a lot more realism. We need to really have respect for and communicate the inertia and responsivity of biodiversity recovery, that it takes time. It takes a lot of effort, and there are levels of recovery that are just not feasible anymore, that are not possible given current conditions. And this is important because in many places, the actions that are needed on biodiversity or for conservation are in poor communities or in poorer countries. And we need to provide very realistic estimates of the potential benefits or the final endpoint that could result from these actions and from the opportunity cost of investing in conservation actions, so that we're not presenting fictions that don't emerge and then just undermine commitment in the future. And then there are two sets of actions that are very important with partners that we would have outside of the biodiversity community itself and into economic sectors. So first is to priority attention to direct and indirect drivers of decline. We have to stop the drivers of decline, otherwise we'll never get to any of the net positive outcomes that we aspire to in the future. And a critical way to do this is to address justice and equity, because the principal drivers of decline are in the top consumers on the planet and not in the bottom. And there are too many people without enough income, without enough benefits from nature, whose footprint does need to increase for them to have a better quality of life, and that needs to come out of the top end of the curve of the global community. In doing this, we can become nature and people positive and change the language so that we're really addressing people's interests at the same time as trying to address nature's interests as well. So where does this take us? Thinking about IUCN's role and contributions, just two remaining slides. And this is very focused on the Conservation Forum and the build-up to IUCN's Global Congress in 2025. So the new work program for 2026 to 2029 is being drafted. We have a new 20-year strategy that is also drafted. And these cover, incredibly complex areas of the 5 key changes that we aspire to succeeding in: transformation, enabling, mobilizing, and so on. These are very similar to what we deal with in IPBES as well. And so I see a lot of consilience and agreement with the findings of IPBES assessments. We've identified 8 transformational areas that are listed over here across these 5 program areas that IUCN has focused on in the last few years. Now, integrating these is very difficult, particularly for any project just focused on a farming system beside a forest in Central Africa, for example. How do you relate to these complex areas identified in IUCN's work program and strategy? And I'm hoping that this construct of the nature economy society model and how our use of NCP in the economy is critical to understand that, how we share benefits in society, and the indirect and direct drivers that cascade back down. These may relate to high-level panels that were discussed later in the day after the opening session in the morning, and in various events through the Africa Conservation Forum in the next 2 days. I leave with 3 key messages or 3 take-homes based on these findings. And the key messages are that we really must ramp up ambition on all and integrated actions on biodiversity and other aspects of our economies. We really need to consolidate gains made in the past, to strengthen those and see how to be better at producing positive impacts in the future. Second key message, it is time for equity, finally, to focus on meeting people's needs. And this is important because this has not been a focus in the past. History has not been kind. A new social contract is necessary within and across countries. And the needs of the most vulnerable must be put at the center of ambition. So this 10, 40, 50 rule of thumb, we do really need to focus on that 50 so that we're looking at nature and people positive at the same time. And a key mechanism has to be restructuring our financial systems. How do we understand how to return financial capital back into natural capital? Because nature is the critical asset that supports the entirety of economies and society, not just niche areas. And of course, it needs many innovative ways to work out how to do this. So thank you very much.